Hey guys, Mr. V. Here doing a book review today for Kristin Lavransdatter by Sigrid Undset. Before I get into my book review, you guys should know I try to do a spoiler-free book review, so if you see me looking down occasionally, I just have some notes so I don't give any spoilers away. So, let me get into the book review for Kristin Lavransdatter. Before I get into the official review, it should be noted that this was actually 3 separate books, or a trilogy, that was released between 1920 and 1922. The book that I am actually going to be reviewing is the more recent modern editions that they just combined all 3 into one book, which is about a 1,200-page book. So you guys should know that before you get into this book. Now, let's talk about what the book is about. So the book takes place in the 1300s in medieval Norway. And it's basically just about, you follow the life of Kristin. And you see what her family is like, her friends, all that. And you basically follow her life from the time she's like either 5 or 6, I don't know the exact age, but you follow her from that time. And it takes place over a wide time frame. And you just see the situations she goes through and how she deals with them. Now, on the surface, it seems like a pretty simple story because a lot of things she's doing is just like everyday life situations, you know, and a lot of times it's the situations that real people deal with. Now, don't forget, this did take place this is set in the 1300s, so it's the medieval times, you know, just so be aware of that, things like kings and stuff like that. But for the most part, it's just stuff that everyday people dealt with. Yet, this book, despite seeming like a simple concept, is incredibly complex. And I say complex in a great way. It's incredibly complex because the stories become intertwined, and then she is left with many tough situations, and she has to make a lot of tough decisions, and then like what happens after those decisions. And again, the storylines become very intertwined, and it is really fun. And I would say that, you know, this is a very deep book when you see some of the things she has to deal with. It becomes very deep, and I'd say like deep in a philosophical type of way. While the book does deal with some religious aspects, I look more at the philosophy behind it. Because I know in the book they continually bring up like religion and things like that. But when you see the decisions she needs to make, it's like, it's not only her, sometimes it's her friends, her parents, you know, it could be things like that. And it's like, you have to think back to the philosophy behind it, and it just, again, it's hard to explain without reading it or giving spoilers away, but I think that it was very well presented, and the reason being is because it was just incredibly well written. The author did a great job on the writing because she just had great pacing throughout the whole book, and I did not feel that it would drag at any points, or I did not feel it was rushed. And when you combine it, because you remember it's a trilogy, it's 3 books, but when you combine it, it ends up being about 1,200 pages, and it did not feel like it dragged or that it felt rushed. So like, I just thought the pacing was great. And another thing that she did well when writing it was she did amazing character development. I always love character development, but she did a great job with the character development because you get to know who these characters are, and then you get to see like what these characters do with the situations they're given. So you see some of the great traits in humans, but you also see some of the horrible traits in human. And again, it's just day-to-day situations, and you just keep seeing it because, you know, the book takes place over, I'm not going to say the amount of time, but the book takes place over a decent amount of time. So, you know, and that's why I said you get to see a lot of the good and bad traits in people. I'm not going to go through each thing you get to see, but the biggest ones that I wrote down are things like you get to see some of the great things like love and what people will do for love. But a lot of times, like things that people overlook, and I saw it in this book, is that people do some amazing things for love. But then also people do some pretty nasty or evil things for love. And, you know, it's pretty crazy when you take a step back and you are reading it. But, you know, it does show you the good and the bad. And it shows you things like the hypocrisy that people have. Many people can be hypocrites in terms of they will start condemning everybody around them despite them doing the same thing or having done the same thing previously. Yet when it comes back to them, they become hypocrites and they start criticizing them. And, we do see this in everyday life. Even though this book was written over 100 years ago, but it still holds true today. And another one is, and it kind of leads into, from the hypocrisy one, is selfishness, and how many times people will act in their own interest. And the core you can see many times when they're being selfish is also like, what is selfishness? What some people consider selfish, other people in the book may not consider selfish, and it's like, what is selfishness? And many times just acting in your own interest. And there again, it's just a lot of things become intertwined because sometimes your own interests are deceiving somebody. But then you're being selfish by doing that, but maybe you're deceiving them, which they feel, the character would feel, is for a good reason, or they're deceiving someone for love. And you could see how it becomes very complex. And there, I gave you just a brief example of how you can do it without giving any names out in the book. But, it was stuff like that. And then it led into my next big one, was deception of friends and family. There's many times in the book where, despite loving each other, they would deceive sometimes even their closest friends or their closest family members. And many times it wasn't just one deception. It was like almost like a two-way street. Like the husband would deceive the wife, and then the wife would deceive the husband, or it would be like the parents would deceive the kids, and then it would be like there was just so many times. And that's why I said, despite it being a pretty simple premise, it becomes very complex and very deep. And one of the best that I loved that kept showing up in the book was regret in life and also in like fights. And we've all been through that, where sometimes so many times after they'd get into a fight or something they would do in life, they would sit back and be like, they wish they could have undone something, and they can't. It's too late. And we've all been in those spots where it's like, you get into a fight, you get angry, and you say something you wish you really would not have said. But then it's like, you can't undo it. And it's like, what do you do, and like how you go about after? And, it shows that at different times. And, and that's why I really feel that that's why I feel like this was a pretty deep and hard-hitting book, because a lot of the situations, if you take a step back, you're like, wow, you can almost see it happening sometimes in your own life. You can see it happening in other people's lives. You can just see it happening at times. And that's where I said it's very, very hard-hitting at times. And I say that in a great way, because you kind of go through all the different types of emotions when reading this book. Like an example will be, sometimes you'll feel such anger at a character because you'll feel like they acted in such a selfish or bad way. Yet later, when more is revealed, you'll kind of have pity for that character. You'll be like, oh, I can see why they acted in that way. And what seemed selfish initially maybe was not as selfish as it was when more comes out. And then you start to feel some pity and sorrow for them. And sometimes it's the opposite. You feel pity and sorrow, and then you start to get angry later at the character. And that's why I said it was a very, very fun read in that fashion. And you should know that despite me talking about these everyday life situations, this can still be a very intense book, because this was a very intense book. You don't need to have just a ton of wars or tons of things like that for it to be intense. It can be intense through different arguments. And again, it takes place in the 1300s where, there were kings, or they would draw their swords against each other, things like that. And it can be intense when, I'll just give a quick example of like when a guy is messing around with someone's wife, and then it starts to build more and more and more, and then the two finally meet. And it's not to say they're meeting for a sword fight, but what are they going to do? And what is the wife? How is she going to stop it? What will happen? What will be the consequences? And then it's just like, how do they remedy it? And it can really build intensity without much violence, and really hardly any violence. So, that's why I don't want you guys to think that intensity is only through like wars and things like that. And as for the ending, I thought the ending was also amazing. I judge an end a lot, of course, if you enjoy it, but also I judge an end by, does it wrap everything up nicely? Like, are there many loose ends? Are you wondering about a lot of things? And, I felt this book didn't have many loose ends at the end of the book, that it was really well done. You didn't really have many questions at the end, and I enjoyed the end, so that was really good. So, as you can see, I gave you many of the positives of the book. Now, some of the things I did not like about the book, there was actually only one major thing I did not like about the book. And the major thing I did not like about the book was the amount of characters it had. They have so many characters. Now, again, don't forget, this takes place over a decent amount of time. This is over a 1,200-page book. But it does have many, many characters. And many of them are short-lived. It's kind of like life, how, you'll meet someone, you'll befriend them for a few months, and then you guys kind of just go on your own way. You may meet each other again in a year or two. There's things like that. But it was just sometimes very tough to keep up because there's different family from different siblings. Then there's your cousins, and then there's in-laws and their families, and then their cousins, and then there's friends and the author does a great job of mixing it all together well with high intensity, but it can sometimes be tough to remember who is who. It can definitely be tough. And even if they have character lists online, and they even have like graphs of how many characters there are and why you can get those, which if you read this book, I would recommend a character list, but don't get a character list until at least halfway through the book, because if you get a character list too soon, it's going to spoil part of the book. I was starting to get confused at points to where I did find a character list, but I'd finished like 3/4 of the book, and I had recognized that if I got the character list earlier, it would have spoiled part of the book, because then you learn about if certain people get married or who dies or what happens and the relation of all these things. So that's why it can spoil it if you get a character list too soon. So if you read this book, I would suggest that if you get a character list, wait until at least the halfway mark, but if you don't get a character list, that'd be even better if you can remember everybody. But that was really the only downfall I saw in the book. So I'm going to give it my official rating. Before I give it my official rating, I would say that, while I thought this was an amazing book before you get my rating, I think this book is meant for people that are over 18 or even over 21. And it's not due to like adult content or anything like that. It's more that I think if you were under the age of 18, you may not appreciate the book as much. I'm still very young, but I've still seen many situations that are similar, and I could at least appreciate the situation that's happening a lot more. Whereas I feel if you're under 18, you just would not get it, and then you wouldn't get the message that is trying to be sent through the theme of the book. So that's why I would recommend it for people over 18 or over 21, but that is of course your decision. But let me give it my official rating. So I always rank my books on a scale of 0 to 10. A 0 is an awful book. A 5 is average, and a 10 is a phenomenal book. To where if it gets a 10, that should definitely be put on your reading list, because I'm a very tough critic. That a 5 is average, and it's tough to even move up 1 point in my rating system, because I feel many books are average. So again, it's hard to move up even 1 point. So for this book, Kristin Lavransdatter, I'm going to rank this book a 9.5, which in my rating system is incredibly high. There's very few books that can even reach it to the 9 category. So a 9.5, I thought this book deserves a 9.5 because it was just amazing. It was just amazing. It was very well written, and that she can just draw you into the book. And it's just with everyday life situations that Kristin is going through and the decisions that she makes. And I did not feel, despite it being 1,200 pages, that it did not drag or feel rushed, and that there's just continuous intense situations, because it does get very intense. And you just do that, yet it does not overdo it. And that's very difficult in a book. And I also thought the author did a great job of when she would place certain events and certain characters. Like, she just did a phenomenal job doing that. And that is why I'm giving it a 9.5. Remember, a 5 is average for me, and a 9.5 is incredibly high. Very, very few books reach it to the 9 category. So that's why I actually think that you guys would really enjoy this book. But if you go into this book, you want to have a plan to stick it out, because, it can be a little difficult in the beginning while you're starting. But if you stick it out, I guarantee you guys will enjoy the book. If you guys have any questions, disagreements, anything like that, please post it in the comments section below. I hope you guys click the subscribe button as I do many book reviews. Anyway, thank you for watching my book review today. This is Mr. V. I hope you guys enjoy reading.